It all started in 1925 in the small town of Koboko in what was then the British Protectorate of Uganda. A child was born who would one day become one of the most feared and ruthless dictators of the 20th century, IDI AMIN DADA. Born into poverty and uncertainty, his early life was marked by abandonment, rejection, and a relentless struggle for survival. Amin's upbringing was far from the luxurious or privileged life enjoyed by some. His father was absent, and his mother, a peasant woman, had to raise him and his siblings in a world where survival itself was an everyday battle. From an early age, Amin was faced with the harsh realities of a colonial world. Uganda, like much of Africa, was being ravaged by the effects of British colonialism, and the lives of its inhabitants were subject to the whims of a foreign power. But despite these challenges, Amin showed early signs of greatness, or perhaps, as it would turn out, a thirst for power that would eventually shape his future. His natural athleticism and imposing physical presence led him to a career in the military, a decision that would eventually change the course of his life. As Uganda struggled for independence, Amin would become a key figure in the military, rising quickly through the ranks. However, it was not just Amin's military prowess that would define him. It was his ability to manipulate, to charm, and to control those around him that would make him the figure he became. But this was just the beginning. The world would soon come to know a different Amin, a man who would go from being a national hero to a monstrous tyrant. It was in 1971 that Amin's rise to power began. With Uganda on the brink of political and economic chaos, he seized an opportunity and staged a military coup that would change the course of the nation's history. Amin's regime was marked by brutal violence, paranoia, and a cult of personality that saw him portrayed as a godlike figure to his people. His rule was characterized by fear, death, and the systematic purging of anyone he perceived as a threat. Once in power, Amin's true nature began to emerge. The man who had once been a humble soldier, rising through the ranks to become Uganda's leader, now reveled in the power he had seized. His first move was to purge his own army, ensuring loyalty by executing or imprisoning anyone who might dare to challenge him. Fear spread like wildfire, not just in Uganda's military, but across every corner of society. Amin's reign of terror took many forms. One of the most chilling aspects was his brutal treatment of political opponents, many of whom were tortured and murdered without trial. The international community turned a blind eye, either due to the complexities of Cold War politics or because of complicity of foreign powers who had supported his rise to power. Amin was a key player in the geopolitical struggle between East and West, a pawn in the global chess game that ultimately allowed him to escape scrutiny. His regime also sought to instill a sense of nationalism, but it was a nationalism based on fear and oppression. Amin promised a new Uganda, one that would be free from colonial influence and ruled by the people. But what he delivered was far from that. Under his leadership, Uganda became a state of terror. Families were torn apart, and communities were decimated by Amin's policies. The economy, once thriving, collapsed under the weight of corruption and mismanagement. What had been a vibrant, prosperous nation quickly turned into a fractured, poverty-stricken country where violence was the only law. But Amin didn't stop there. He also launched a campaign against Uganda's Asian population, expelling over 50,000 Asians from the country in 1972. This decision, which was justified as an effort to reclaim Uganda's economy for Ugandans, was rooted in Amin's racial and political ideologies. It was a move that not only destroyed Uganda's economic infrastructure, but also turned the world's attention to his increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior. The atrocities committed under Amin's rule were so vast and brutal that the international community could no longer ignore them. But even as the world looked on in horror, Amin continued to rule with impunity. The United Nations, the United States, and other foreign powers were either unwilling or unable to intervene. Amin had the support of key allies, including Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who shared his anti-imperialist rhetoric and saw Amin as a fellow revolutionary. In Uganda, however, the violence only escalated. By the mid-1970s, Amin's paranoia had reached new heights. His grip on power became more tenuous as his government began to fracture. But instead of taking steps toward reconciliation or reform, he doubled down, executing anyone he suspected of treason, often without evidence. Even members of his own family were not immune to his wrath. By the late 1970s, Amin's regime was starting to show signs of decay. The economy had crumbled, and the country was in ruins. Political instability and infighting within his government left Amin vulnerable, but it was his military misadventures that would ultimately lead to his downfall. In 1978, Amin made a catastrophic decision. He invaded neighboring Tanzania. His military strategy was flawed, and the invasion quickly turned into a disaster. Tanzanian forces, along with Ugandan exiles, mounted a counteroffensive that pushed Amin's troops back and captured Kampala, Uganda's capital, in April 1979. The world watched in disbelief as the once-feared dictator was forced to flee Uganda. Amin, who had ruled with an iron fist, now became a man on the run. With his regime collapsing around him, Amin sought refuge in Libya, where he was granted asylum by Muammar Gaddafi, his longtime ally. But Amin's exile was far from a peaceful one. Though he lived in relative comfort in Libya and later in Saudi Arabia, he was a man in hiding, his past haunting him every day. The international community turned its back on him, and he lived out the remainder of his days in obscurity. His name, once synonymous with power and fear, became little more than a whispered memory. But Amin never showed remorse for the atrocities he had committed. In interviews conducted during his exile, he continued to justify his actions, painting himself as a hero of Africa and blaming his downfall on foreign conspiracies. He never acknowledged the millions of lives lost under his rule, nor the pain and suffering he had caused to his people. Amin's final years were spent in relative anonymity in Saudi Arabia, where he died in 2003. Despite the passage of time, the legacy of his brutality remains ingrained in Uganda's history, and his name is forever associated with one of the darkest chapters in African politics. The legacy of Idi Amin is one that remains controversial, even decades after his death. To many, he is remembered as a brutal dictator, a man whose lust for power destroyed a nation and left countless victims in his wake. But for some, particularly those who benefited from his regime, Amin is still viewed as a symbol of resistance, a leader who stood up to foreign influence and attempted to assert Uganda's independence. In Uganda, the scars of Amin's reign are still visible. The country is still grappling with the aftermath of his rule, and many of the institutions that were destroyed during his time in power have never fully recovered. The military, once a source of national pride, is now a symbol of fear, and the economy, once one of the most promising in Africa, has never regained its former strength. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Amin's reign is the psychological damage he inflicted on the people of Uganda. For many, the fear and trauma of living under his dictatorship is something that continues to affect their lives today. Families were torn apart, neighbors betrayed one another, and the culture of fear that Amin instilled in the population has left a lasting legacy. In recent years, there has been a growing movement in Uganda to acknowledge the crimes of the Amin regime and to seek justice for the victims. Some survivors have spoken out, recounting the horrors they witnessed, while others have begun to push for official recognition of the atrocities committed during his rule. However, there are still many who deny the full extent of Amin's crimes, and the country remains deeply divided over how to remember this dark chapter in its history. As for Amin himself, his death in 2003 marked the end of an era, but his legacy continues to haunt Uganda. His name is still invoked in political discourse, with some using it as a warning against the dangers of unchecked power, while others use it as a symbol of defiance. For better or worse, Idi Amin will forever be etched into the history of Africa as one of its most infamous figures. When Idi Amin seized power in 1971, the international community was initially unsure how to respond. Amin's rise was marked by his bravado and his anti-colonial rhetoric, which garnered some support from African leaders and non-aligned nations. However, his brutal tactics and human rights abuses quickly drew widespread condemnation from Western powers and international organizations. Despite this, Amin managed to maintain strong relationships with certain countries, including Libya, which provided him with military support and political backing. His ties with Muammar Gaddafi were particularly important, as both leaders shared a common vision of African unity and anti-imperialism. The two men forged a political alliance that helped sustain Amin's regime during its most critical years. Yet, for much of the world, Amin was a pariah. The United States and the United Kingdom condemned his actions and imposed sanctions on Uganda, but their response was often tempered by Cold War politics. Amin, once a pawn in the global struggle for influence, now found himself isolated on the world stage. His violent purges and acts of repression alienated much of the international community, and he soon became a symbol of tyranny and unchecked power. In the United Nations, Amin's regime was frequently the subject of debate, with some countries calling for action to address his human rights abuses, while others, particularly those in the non-aligned movement, defended him as a victim of Western imperialism. This division in the international community reflected the complexity of the Cold War era, where ideological lines often blurred, and leaders like Amin could exploit the tensions between East and West for their own gain. As the years passed and Amin's power began to wane, the international response to his regime became increasingly critical. His military defeat in 1979, following his invasion of Tanzania, was a turning point. Amin was ousted from power, and Uganda's subsequent return to stability was welcomed by the international community. But the damage had already been done. Amin had left behind a legacy of violence, division, and suffering that would take decades to heal. Today, as the world reflects on the legacy of Idi Amin, his reign remains a cautionary tale. The failure of the international community to take decisive action against him and the subsequent chaos that followed serves as a reminder of the dangers of allowing tyrants to rule unchecked. The final years of Idi Amin's life were marked by isolation and reflection, but also by an ongoing refusal to accept responsibility for the horrors he had inflicted on his people. After his downfall in 1979, Amin fled Uganda and sought asylum in Libya before settling in Saudi Arabia, where he lived in relative obscurity until his death in 2003. During his years in exile, Amin continued to deny the atrocities committed under his rule. In interviews with foreign journalists, he often justified his actions, portraying himself as a hero of African liberation, and blaming his downfall on foreign conspiracies. He never showed remorse for the suffering he had caused and maintained the delusion that he had been a champion of his people. Amin's years in Saudi Arabia were marked by a life of quiet obscurity. Though he lived in relative comfort, he was constantly haunted by the memories of the violence and terror that had marked his reign. His name, once feared and revered, had become synonymous with tyranny and cruelty. In the years following his death, the international community's perception of Amin remained largely unchanged. He is still remembered as one of the most brutal and despised dictators of the 20th century. His reign, characterized by violence, repression, and the destruction of a nation, left an indelible mark on the history of Uganda and Africa as a whole. Amin's legacy is complex, and while there are some who continue to defend him, the overwhelming consensus is that his rule was one of the darkest chapters in modern history. His time in power, though short-lived, caused immense suffering and left deep scars on the people of Uganda. But the question remains, how do we reconcile the man who was once seen as a liberator with a tyrant who unleashed such destruction? The answer is not simple, and the legacy of Idi Amin continues to be a subject of debate and reflection. His story is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of tyranny. The story of Idi Amin is a stark reminder of how unchecked power can lead to immense suffering and destruction. Amin's rise to power, his brutal reign, and his eventual downfall offer valuable lessons for both present and future generations. The international community's failure to intervene in time, combined with the internal forces that allowed Amin to come to power, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of indifference and complacency. One of the most important lessons from Amin's reign is the role of the military in authoritarian regimes. Amin's rise was largely facilitated by his control over the Ugandan military, and his ability to manipulate and eliminate rivals within the armed forces played a crucial role in his success. Military dictatorships, like Amin's, often rely on the loyalty of the military to maintain control, and this makes them particularly dangerous. The military becomes not only a tool of power, but also a source of fear, as soldiers are often tasked with carrying out violent orders without question. Another key lesson from Amin's rule is the power of propaganda and the cult of personality. Amin went to great lengths to build a narrative of himself as the savior of Uganda, and his use of propaganda helped to maintain his hold on power for years. He was portrayed as a larger-than-life figure, a leader who would free Uganda from the shackles of colonialism and guide the nation to prosperity. In reality, however, his leadership led Uganda to ruin, and his propaganda was nothing more than a smokescreen for the atrocities he was committing. Perhaps the most important lesson from Amin's legacy is the human cost of dictatorship. Amin's rule was marked by widespread human rights abuses, including the murder, torture, and displacement of thousands of innocent people. He used fear and violence to control the population, and those who dared to oppose him were swiftly silenced. The trauma caused by his reign is still felt by many Ugandans today, as the scars of his brutality are passed down through generations. Ultimately, the story of Idi Amin is a story of power gone wrong, a story of how the hunger for control can turn a leader into a monster. It is a reminder that dictators, no matter how powerful they may seem, are always vulnerable to the forces of history, and that no tyrant is invincible. Although Idi Amin's time in power was relatively short, the impact of his regime continues to reverberate through the halls of Ugandan history. His rule left a scar not just on the country, but on the entire region of East Africa. The violence and terror he unleashed left millions of lives destroyed, communities fractured, and a nation crippled by fear. The social fabric of Uganda, which had once been rich in diversity and potential, was ripped apart during his years in power. Even after his ousting in 1979, Amin's influence remained. The military coup that removed him from office did not bring an immediate sense of stability to Uganda. Instead, it ushered in a period of chaos, as factions vied for power and the country struggled to recover from the damage caused by Amin's policies. His legacy, far from being erased, continued to haunt the people of Uganda as they faced the task of rebuilding their nation in the aftermath of his brutality. Amin's actions also left a lasting legacy on the international stage. The world watched, largely helpless, as he terrorized his own people. His ability to maintain power for so long, despite the growing international condemnation, was a testament to the complexity of global politics and the challenges of intervening in the affairs of sovereign nations. Amin's ability to play the geopolitical game, aligning himself with leaders like Muammar Gaddafi, ensured that his reign lasted longer than it might have otherwise. For those who survived his rule, the trauma has been passed down through generations. The memory of Amin's violence and the fear that he instilled in the population remain vivid for many Ugandans. While some have managed to move forward, the scars of his dictatorship are still visible in the country's collective consciousness. Families torn apart by his purges, people displaced by his policies, and communities destroyed by his rule still live with the aftermath of his tyranny. Uganda's recovery from Amin's rule has been slow and painful. The country has made strides in rebuilding its economy and institutions, but the wounds of the past are not easily healed. The search for justice for the victims of Amin's regime has been long, and many feel that true reconciliation has yet to be achieved. The lack of accountability for the atrocities committed during his rule remains a point of contention, and some Ugandans continue to struggle with the question of how to come to terms with the past. The impact of Amin's reign is not confined to Uganda. His rule serves as a grim reminder to the world of the dangers of unchecked power and the capacity of dictators to wreak havoc on their own nations and beyond. The global community, having watched Amin's rise and fall, has a responsibility to learn from his story, ensuring that the horrors of his reign are never repeated. Idi Amin's story is not just a cautionary tale. It is a stark reminder of the fragility of freedom and the price of power. The atrocities committed under his rule are etched in the history of Africa, and they continue to serve as a somber reflection on what can happen when a nation falls under the grip of a dictator. Amin's reign was characterized by cruelty and madness, but also highlighted the ways in which power can be manipulated and abused. His rise to power was swift, and his grip on it even more so, leaving Uganda in the hands of a man who was both unpredictable and terrifying. He used fear to control, violence to maintain order, and propaganda to build an image of himself as a hero, despite the destruction he wrought. But even with the passage of time, Amin's legacy remains complex. Some view him as a symbol of resistance, particularly in the context of his opposition to Western powers and his attempts to assert Uganda's independence. Others see him as the embodiment of all that is wrong with authoritarianism, a man whose obsession with power led to the suffering of millions. His downfall, though inevitable, did little to heal the wounds he left behind. The people of Uganda were left to pick up the pieces, and the international community, while eager to distance itself from the horrors of Amin's regime, failed to offer the kind of support necessary to truly help Uganda recover. Amin's life and legacy raise important questions about the nature of power, the role of international intervention, and the responsibility of the world to prevent such atrocities from occurring again. His story is a tragedy not only for Uganda, but for humanity as a whole. The scars of his rule are still felt today, reminding us all that power, when left unchecked, can destroy everything in its path. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Idi Amin, we are forced to confront the realities of tyranny, the cost of unchecked power, and the tragic consequences of authoritarian rule. His story is not just a tale of a dictator. It is a story about the failure of systems, the betrayal of the people, and the destruction of a nation. Amin's rise to power and his reign of terror serve as a chilling reminder of how easily a nation can fall into the hands of someone who does not value life, liberty, or justice. His ability to manipulate and control, combined with his overwhelming sense of self-importance, allowed him to maintain power for longer than many thought possible. And even in his downfall, he never fully acknowledged the damage he had caused, never fully repented for the lives he destroyed. But perhaps the most important takeaway from Amin's story is the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the horrors that Amin inflicted on his people, Uganda is still standing. The survivors of his reign continue to rebuild their lives and their country, striving to move forward even as they bear the scars of the past. The hope for a better future remains, and the lessons learned from Amin's brutal rule continue to shape the way the world responds to authoritarianism and human rights abuses today. In the end, the story of Idi Amin is a tragic one, but it is also a story of survival, of people who refuse to be crushed by the weight of tyranny. It is a reminder that the fight for freedom is ongoing, and that the power of one individual, no matter how ruthless, can never extinguish the strength of an entire people.